Gutsickgibbon, and I'm here with Danny. We're going to be discussing a little bit of philosophy of biology today. And it's going to be an interesting one. This isn't usually the kind of content I do on this channel, but I think since philosophy kind of underlies all of inquiry, it's important to include anytime we're discussing biology or science in general. And Danny's the philosophy guy around here, so we got him on for this. We're going to be using a text titled Philosophy of Biology by Gottfried Smith as our framework here, and we're just going to kind of be chatting about it. So, Danny, how about you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about philosophy?
Yeah, I'm Danny, and thanks for having me, Erica. So I'm a grad student, getting my master's in philosophy. I already have a bachelor's degree in philosophy. I teach philosophy on the high school level. I love it. Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure.
When someone asks me what is philosophy, because I get that question often, it's so hard to answer the question, right? But there's a couple ways you can think about it, and you got it like the heart of it, right? Like one can think of philosophy as asking the big questions, right? I think there's the author mentions a guy named Wilfred Sellers that kind of frames philosophy in this way, where we're asking questions on sort of the outer rim, like the broad questions, like what is there? Do I exist? Those sorts of what's the meaning of life? Those sorts of questions, right?
How things hang together, I think, is how he frames it.
Right. Yeah, that's how Sellers put it. And I'm going to use an analogy because I'm probably talking to a lot of scientists and not a lot of people that have really investigated philosophy. So I'm going to use an analogy. So in engineering, in engineering, you're using raw materials and what you know in science to fix a problem, maybe adjust it, kind of make sure that the structure is all sound and stuff. Well, we kind of do that in philosophy too, but not on a raw material based. We do it with our thoughts, with our concepts, with our beliefs, right? So we think about what do we mean by, let's say, what do we mean by the word life? When something is alive, what do we mean by that? And we entertain, there's homeostasis involved, and there's reproduction involved, and we give these lists, right? And the second that you start doing that, you're actually kind of doing philosophy. You're analyzing your concept, right? And you might come to something like, oh, well, that can't be true, right? Because if we think life in this way, then computers are life, right? So what you're doing there is that kind of deliberative process of really getting your concepts straight and make sure they all cohere in this nice little package, right?
And of course, criteria, right? That's inherently philosophical, is saying, okay, this list of criteria is what we will use when we're discussing, as you mentioned, life. And I think that's a great way of putting it. It really is the pieces of the whole.
Yeah, there's a third way. So we have the questions, right? With the big inquiry, right? With the inquiries, and then we have the engineering analogy where we're doing conceptual engineering, right? And then there's I think a third one which pertains to what we're doing here is that we can think of philosophy as what we say, what we call as a second order discipline. Now that's a fancy phrase for saying a subject about subjects.
The
right?
meta.
So where biology investigates the maybe life and the world around us, right, and that sort of domain, philosophy investigates in the things that investigate. So we investigate science, we investigate math, right? The math, there's a methodology to it. There's a methodology of biology, physics, psychology, even, and sociology. And we're over here saying, okay, we're a subject about you guys in a way, right? And that's kind of where, why I think this is a happy union between us, right? Where we're analyzing, we're investigating the biology being an investigation of life,
right? Well, I think you could make the argument too that philosophy kind of underpins every discipline in the sense that it's what kind of questions are we actually trying to ask, and philosophy is kind of what helps us suss out what the soft bounds of the subject really are. Because biology is very simply put the study of life, and as you mentioned, it does indeed involve what is life? And what studies of life can be applied to biology? Would the statistics of biology count as biology? It depends on who you ask, but that's what we have the philosophers for. And I think that, Godfrey Smith put it in an interesting kind of frame in the text, in Godfrey Smith's text, which is that kind of philosophy incubates these ideas in biology prior to actually being able to test them. So you are inherently doing philosophy when you're conceptually working through the theories of biology prior to putting them into an empirical sense, a way to kind of measure it with numbers or even categorically.
And there are certain disciplines of philosophy. Like let's take something like philosophy of mind. I'm like, what the heck kind of questions come up there? Isn't that like a thing for psychology or neurology, or like philosophy of mathematics? What sorts of questions do we ask? Well, what sorts of questions do we ask for philosophy of biology? Well, life is a big question. What is that, right? But we're going to kind of give you a preview of like, if for future videos, some of the questions that are raised in philosophy of biology. So what's life? What's an organism? What's an individual that is studied by the biological sciences, right? That's one big one, right? Yeah. Stuff like what is a gene, right? Like those sorts of things, like how to I don't know. I think genetics was they weren't called genes; they were called factors by Mendel. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, because Mendel's and traits too, almost interchangeably. Because the thing that's interesting is like, okay, there's, as a side note, to kind of delve into what we're going to be kind of parsing out and teasing apart. It's like what a gene is in an empirical sense had to first be underpinned by what a gene is in a philosophical sense, right? Like these two things have to be kind of stated up front, because life does get very messy. I mean, asking these kinds of questions and setting out the criteria ahead of time almost helps future-proof a little bit, because biology and life tends to do things where they operate in gradients. And without the philosophical underpinnings there, it's going to be very difficult to categorize things, which is kind of what biology seeks to do in a sense, because categorization allows for analysis. It allows for a deeper understanding.
Yeah, and with respect, biology has a unique, I don't want to say issue, but like a unique question that maybe physics doesn't address. Maybe chemistry also has this question. But like where physics, you might want to say that physics is like this. I mean, I'm not a scientist, right? But the idea of like a fundamental particle and its behavior, physicists are really interested in that question, right? But with biology and chemistry, if there is such a thing like a fundamental particle, what's happening is that there are things that are composed of parts, right? You're not really dealing with the behavior of a fundamental thing. You're dealing with a composite, right? And so there's a big question about, okay, something like a gene, right? Or a molecule like insulin, right? What is insulin, right? Is insulin something that just is reducible to its parts, to where you can almost like eliminate it? We shouldn't really be talking about insulin. We should be talking about these microstructures and these fancy things. Or is it actually something that's new in the world once these fundamental particles assemble in a way where you have that formation, right? So, you have very interesting questions in biology and about like these sorts of structures, like what are the four macromolecules, right? That's what are they? Help me out here. Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids,
yes,
right?
You didn't need my help.
Well, but those four, right? We like you were talking about categorization, right? There might be a question about, well, are these categories as real as like the category of the fundamental particle that physicists are interested in, right? And that's a really cool question, right?
Well, you ruffle some serious feathers when you apply that to something called the biological species concept, which I know you're familiar with. I mean, species, the categorization, even when we're using like classical taxonomy, you start to get into some really interesting questions about where we draw the line and why we draw it there. Can it even be drawn in an objective sense? And that's when you start to make a lot of biologists very angry, because actually
uncomfortable at the least, right?
Like getting to the bottom of that and whether the biological species concept, which is certainly in some aspects useful, but whether or not it's appropriate is a completely different question to ask.
Right. I think the point that Erica and I are driving at is that there are these broader questions, right, in the philosophy of science that really have an impact on the philosophy of biology. So inevitably, we'll be talking about some of the broader issues in philosophy of science, right? But that being said, with a focus on biology. So our philosophy of science is very integral here in terms of how we understand philosophy of biology, physics, and chemistry. If you take those, I mean, I don't know if they're any more. I guess quantum theory is under
you can start
physics.
breaking them down, and you get into
You can break. Yeah, but all very interesting. One other question that we might ask in philosophy of biology is a very, in my opinion, I'm not going to try to give my opinion all the time here, but in my opinion, one of the most interesting questions. Purpose and function in biology. Okay, so that is a really, really fun topic. It does have cultural implications. You have a lot of the creationists and ID theorists coming out of the woodwork here and appeal to notions of function and purpose as something that supports their framework. And that, to me, whether you agree or disagree, is an interesting claim. Okay, and we're going to definitely entertain that and analyze that in a serious way. So
that should be done regardless of the perspective you're coming from. I mean, the nature of science, whether you're dealing in biology or any of the other fields, is to suss out truth and to suss out truth as we perceive it, as we see it, and almost more importantly, again, depending on who you ask, how that truth becomes applicable to our lives. And function happens to be one of those. Function, when you're dealing with the genome and when you're dealing with even specific genes, starts to get into a very interesting business because it affects things like our health and medicine.
Right, yeah. And I think the idea here is also that purpose and function seem to be, well, like when we ask what is the function of an electron, that might be weird semantically. It sounds kind of weird, but what is the function of insulin? Sounds like there's something a little bit that we're adding to the word when we're talking about something like insulin versus what is the function. For electrons don't have function, they just do things, right? They behave in regular ways, considering their electrical charge and such, right? But insulin, we want to say in biology, we have to make sense of this word function and purpose because we attribute and predicate that term to things in biology that you don't really see in chemistry and physics, which makes biology really cool, I think, and a very unique science comparatively, right?
It absolutely is. And I think, too, kind of alluding, digging in a little bit more there, I guess you would say, is this idea of naturally developed function versus kind of applied function, something that humans can create a new function for a given property. So the snake venom, well, what is the purpose of snake venom? Well, it can be defense for the snake. It could be predation. It could help the snake in its ability to predate on other animals. But we can use snake venom in an entirely new way, which is to say we develop anti-venom with it. Or clotting agents in other cases. So it's like giving something new function too kind of muddies the waters as to what function is and why it's so important to get into, which gets back to the whole, well, it depends on which category of function you're looking at, and it's beautiful and messy and great.
And I will say that that you have a spectrum of thought here. At least in philosophy of biology and philosophy of science, I don't know, I can't speak for the biologist, okay? There are a whole range of views about what function is. For instance, I think is Dr. Nicholson takes function to be what we call a normative notion, which is to say that we're expressing goodness, badness, what should happen. Okay,
something awful.
But then you got people on the opposite side, and he's not a creation. I think, to my knowledge, he's not a theist. Okay, and then we have people on the opposite side that say, "Hey, function, we should get rid of the word." Right, we should be talking like the chemist and like the physicist, right?
Right.
So there's like a broad array of views here with respect to this issue, right? Let's move on to because we do have other stuff to discuss apart from the sorts of questions we might ask in biology, but we'll be addressing stuff like is there human nature? I think Godfrey Smith mentioned he distinguishes like philosophy of science from philosophy of nature. Yep. And that's an interesting distinction. I don't see it that often, but the idea is that I think the way that he understands philosophy of biology, or biology itself rather, is to be more of a methodology or an instrument, I should say, to get at how nature is. Right. Okay, so, right.
And that can be very troublesome almost, because it's like determining what it is that science or data is telling us depends on kind of how your science works, what you determine science to be, and how you determine objectivity with both data and then subsequently with its interpretation and analysis, or analysis and interpretation rather.
Yeah. So with respect to like humans, do we, there's like this question about whether we have a nature, or like whether we're like kind of, I mean, I think the way that Godfrey Smith puts it is it's an open question in the first part of his writing, that do we even have a nature, right? Is that something that if we don't have a nature, then actually it's not to study. There's not, the biology wouldn't address such a thing, right? Obviously, right? That it obviously follows that biology doesn't really care because it doesn't exist. But if we have a human nature, that's something that biology is interested in, right?
Humans being a part of nature, certainly. And the follow-up question that you would have, of course, would be, if humans have a nature, do other organisms? And how does that work? Is it kind of grouped and restricted, or is it a smooth gradient, as much of life tends to be?
Mm-hmm. And lastly, I mean, there are a lot of things to question biology. I think this is the last big one, too, that I find rather interesting, is the nature of, or I shouldn't use nature given how we just defined it, but like what is information?
Yeah.
What is communication? Okay. Very, very tough questions, right? If anybody wants to see how difficult it is to get at this notion of information, just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, put in information, and you will not get a straight answer. Mm-hmm. You will not get a straight answer. But there are different kinds of information, perhaps. And this also factors into communication, right? We're communicating, right? Are dolphins communicating? Right. I think that might be a question that the biologist is interested in, at least.
It is.
And I know that like someone like Noam Chomsky distinguishes communication from something like signaling.
Or vocalization. Right? I mean, there's this whole concept of information with communication, that you've got a sender and you've got a receiver, and you're transmitting some kind of message, right? And at some point, right, as humans, we tend to suppose that transforms from the state of like pheromone communication or vocalization, pheromone communication rather in insects, and vocalization in kind of more basal animals, and it eventually becomes communication when you reach some sort of higher level of animal. Where's that line? What does that line look like? Why is the line there? Can it even be drawn? I mean, that to me, that's this consistent question in biology, is why do we draw the lines where we draw them in order to create these categories? And if the lines can't be drawn, are the categories not arbitrary? And that becomes this consistent theme, at least in what I see, whether we're dealing in the likes of evolution or whether we're looking at something more microscopic in the sense of looking at genetics. So it becomes a very interesting kind of streamline of questions, and I don't know that it's standardized. Like, I don't know, as you mentioned, like different people use these terms in different ways, and different people draw these lines in different places.
Right, and this is a job for those that want to think about the concept of communication. What are we talking about? So this is a job of the philosopher or the biologist that wants to do philosophy for biology to ask, what is communication? How do we differentiate it from non-communication, or something like signaling, right? And you've brought up a big one too. Of course, biologists are interested in evolution and natural selection, and so are philosophers and biologists. Very, very integral in biology. It's there is actually a question about how do theories and laws work in biology. It seems like they work a little bit differently than in physics and maybe chemistry. I think there's a philosopher of science named Alex Rosenberg. He debated William Lane Craig, for those that are interested in philosophy of religion. He thinks that there's only one law or theory in biology, and that's the theory of natural selection. Others don't think that. They think that they consider things like Mendel's law.
Proposed laws of heritability and the like, yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Of course, someone like Rosenberg has definitely considered these sorts of things, but for some reason has omitted them from the category of biological theory or law. Yeah. We here, Eric and I want to understand these motivations. Okay.
Well, and to kind of parse the contentious nature of it out and just look at what the questions are and kind of how it is that we consider them. I think that that's really important, and this kind of makes for a nice segue into sort of the history of this line of thinking, because being a conversation about the philosophy of biology means that you really can't get around talking about evolution being this foundational truth of biology. This idea that organisms change over time isn't new. People tend to look at it and say, you know what? I mean, like Darwin did it. He was like common descent and natural selection, and then he kind of went like this and let science run with it.
Right. It started with the pre-Socratics. Empedocles was a pre-Socratic. I think I could be wrong on the dates, so someone can fact check me, but I think it's 400 BCE.
Yeah, 430.
Okay.
Yeah, had it in my cheat sheet.
Oh, perfect. I don't have it in front of me right now. But so this guy. I mean, what he took a view that maybe you can characterize it better than me, where like there are these like parts of organisms that kind of find themselves together, right? Not exactly evolution. I don't think most people would credit him with an evolutionary idea, but it sounds very similar. The idea is that like there's a gradualness to the whole organism,
well,
right?
Not just that, but he's got this idea, I mean, you characterized it quite well, that the parts of these organisms are sort of limping about. An arm here, a leg there, eyeballs, a tongue, I don't know, teeth, which is actually like pretty Lovecraftian when you think about it. It's kind of horrific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But this idea that these
a tentacle there,
Yeah, these bits, an eldritch horror over there. But the idea that these things are finding themselves and combining into these larger scale organisms is, of course, as Danny said, this idea of gradualism, but almost more importantly, I would propose, is this idea that Empedocles proposed, where the bad combinations are weeded out. They don't survive. The poor combinations are selected against, as later knowledge or later kind of terminology would come to describe it. And, because he's got this idea that, of course, if you just have an eyeball kind of seated on top of a leg, this organism combination isn't going to work. So it's going to not survive. A very, very basal version of survival of the fittest from 430 BCE, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and a side note to Empedocles, he's the guy that that people attribute to coming up with the four elements. For my Last Airbender people, water, fire, earth, all that. I think they called them roots, though. I think there was a different term. We called them roots.
That's some serious Fire Nation propaganda leaving
right.
out of the group there.
Which brings us to Plato and Aristotle. Now, once again, most people would say they don't paint an evolutionary picture yet, but once again, you have similar themes. So Aristotle, for instance, had this like scale, not like I don't know how to say it in the Latin, but it translates to something like natural scale. Okay, where you had the more basic organisms and the bottom, so like you had plants or whatever, and then you had animals, and then man, and then he did include angels and God. Okay, but the interesting thing here is that he thought they were connected in some kind of way and ordered. Okay,
he did. Yeah.
So. Yeah,
and he drew this very interesting line of the basal to the complex, and it's kind of interesting that he didn't draw an ancestry line there. So he had the categorization, but it lacked the time scale.
Right, and it was very influential. I'm not too sure about this, but I think Rene Descartes, the French modern philosopher in the early 1600s, had something similar called a chain of being. So you have this kind of theme of natural scale or complexity and this kind of connectedness, which brings us to Linnaeus, right?
Father's taxonomy.
Yeah. So we have. Is this one of the? Now you're going to be more of an expert on Linnaeus than I am, presumably, but. Is this our first recorded effort in making a formal system for?
For classifying organisms, he's generally understood to be the OG, right? Like he's coming out and he's saying, all right, we've got these organisms and we can put them into these related groups and categorize them in a sense that we can understand them better. And very, very interestingly, he was a young Earth creationist, and yet he found it very difficult to place humans, outside of the other animals. He could find no reason why we shouldn't consider humans along with the other living organisms, and in fact, he placed them with the other apes. Upon seeing their skeletons all together, and his quote is, it kind of tickles me a little bit because I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he was like, yeah, I can think of no reason by which not to lump man with simian or simian with man, but I should find one lest I bring all of the theologians down upon my head. And he's like, and maybe I should, just by the nature of the discipline. And I think he...
Yeah, that's where...
Oh, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Oh, man. There's a term for this, and it's really going to bother me. But what you're sort of talking about is that there's this dichotomy, and that started with, the ancient philosophers, that there's this dichotomy between man and beast. Where man is one of reason and beast is understood in terms of drives and instincts and passions. Okay, so there's like this very strong dividing line, and so what you said there seems to suggest that as we get closer to the modern era, we see that line getting a little blurry all of a sudden, right?
And it's partially because, as you mentioned, the separation between man and beast tended to be this ability to reason, but Linnaeus wanted to use specifically physical characteristics. He wanted to use morphology, body and form, to categorize animals, and of course, being our body is just made of chemicals and other bits and bobs that compose our physiology. It became quite problematic. Reason is not something that's very tangible, which is why by Linnaean taxonomy it became quite hard to separate humans out. Right.
And then we have Darwin in the 19th century, right? But a lot of people in the 18th century started Darwin's grandfather, right? I think his name was Erasmus, and not to be confused with the humanist Erasmus. I think. But when I first read it, I thought I was alluding to the Erasmus from the Renaissance era, or maybe it was a little bit before the Renaissance. I'm not so sure, but Darwin had a grandfather, Erasmus, and started coming up with evolutionary ideas.
Well, and lest we sleep on Lamarck, Lamarckian evolution was a whole thing in and of itself. He had this idea that there is an inheritance of acquired characteristics. So the way that these traits are passed down is if the parent acquired them previously. So the classic example of the giraffe that stretches his neck up to munch on some of the leaves, and if he stretches it and stretches it and stretches it enough during his lifetime, he'll be able to pass on that longer neck to his offspring. Which
something like use is very important in the Linnaean, not the Lamarckian framework, right?
Oh yeah.
But I think Lamarck started publishing stuff in the early 1800s, but you had people in the 1750s. There's this there's this French Enlightenment philosopher Diderot, who's pretty famous. He started having these sort of ideas of that Darwin's grandfather had, and other evolutionary ideas. And I think he was thrown in prison. I'm not so sure exactly. Maybe if you remember, I think it had to do with this notion of filament. Do you have more to say about that?
Yeah, it gets at it a little bit, but it tends to not be so focused on this idea that was pending and kind of brewing under the surface of organisms and how they change. The filament was a bit tangential to that, I think.
Okay, but the idea is that you had Lamarck, right, and then but you had all these thinkers before him that started to think like in evolutionary ways, right? And then, of course, we get to Mr. Darwin, right?
Charles Darwin. He's got such an interesting history in and of himself. He's this guy who originally wants to be a surgeon, and then he finds out he's very squeamish. So instead, he says, "All right, well, maybe I'll do the pastor route and do the theology thing." And kind of on a whim, he's very interested in paley, which I'm sure we'll touch on in a bit. But kind of on a whim, he takes this gig as a naturalist, is traveling on the Beagle, around the world and documenting life and looking at how it changed. And the very kind of cornerstone of this too is that Charles Lyell had just come out with the foundations of geology, these ideas of uniformitarianism, that things that we observe today probably happened at similar paces throughout time. And that kind of gave a very ancient tag to the Earth. And Darwin thought to himself, okay, this is happening to rocks. Who's to say that it isn't happening to organisms? And there were two other, very influential ideas that would underpin evolution by natural selection. And if you want to tell us a bit about Paley and kind of how that impacted him, and as well
Yeah.
as both of them.
So there's this huge, what do you call it? Tension between intelligent design and evolutionary theory. But I will say that Darwin did not hand wave intelligent design. No. He was actually really interested in it. Okay. He respected William Paley. Okay. He read his work. Okay. Make sure he understood what he had to say before he dismissed it. Okay. But ultimately, he was unpersuaded by Paley. Okay. Mainly because he would see sort of these horrific things in nature that didn't seem to cohere well with an omni-God. That's to say, a God that was all good, all powerful, and all knowing. Okay. Like a good example, I think the wasp in the worm, is it the caterpillar?
Yeah,
what happens there?
Parasitoid wasps. Yeah, Darwin is very wigged out, properly so, by this concept of parasitoid wasps. So there's this very elegant way of reproducing, not for the squeamish, ironic coming from Darwin, but there's this very elegant and disturbing, unsettling way that some solitary wasps reproduce. And it's known as, everyone knows parasitism, but then there's parasitoid wasps, which actually parasitize in their means of reproduction. So they'll fly up to a caterpillar, or sometimes they're these, bark termites and the like, or bark beetles that live under the bark of trees, and they sting. They sting the organism until it's paralyzed, and then lay their eggs either on the surface or the back of the organism, or sometimes there have been more precise way of doing it where they actually inject the eggs into the organism, which, so depending on whether you're the wasp or the beetle, can be a more foolproof way of ensuring that your offspring make it to actually hatching. And essentially, as the babies hatch, be it on the back of the bug, or back of the insect, or grub, or on the inside, they slowly consume it, and eventually, once they're large enough and have consumed enough of their host, they flutter on to go do the same thing to more other insects. And of course, this is incredibly intelligently designed. If you really want to look at how efficient it is, but Darwin kind of thought, okay, well, if God is omnibenevolent and nature is red in tooth and claw, this seems to be a nature design. If anyone's getting at it,
Right. I mean, like, this is the problem of animal suffering seemed to be a problem for Darwin, enough to where Paley was not very convincing, but very interesting
ways of suffering. It was these incredibly elaborate, very grotesque in his mind ways of suffering that were just a little bit like almost overkill, right? Like,
yeah,
it didn't have to be that gruesome, and yet here we were.
So he was influenced by, I think, Charles Lyell, right? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yep,
okay.
Lyell.
And then William Paley. He was influenced by William Paley. Heavily respected him. And also Thomas Malthus. Now, Malthus had this idea that there's this kind of like struggle for life, right? So here we have something like the survival of the fittest kind of emerge from Malthus's ideas, right? So these three are, Darwin credits them, right? He owes a lot to these three thinkers in terms of how his views developed with respect to evolutionary biology at the time, right? But it's very interesting, right, to see the history. And I think that helps us do some of the philosophy of biology in terms of how we got from, the different philosophical views changed and the views of biology changed through time. And so it's interesting.
Right, yeah, it almost was this perfect storm for evolution by natural selection to come about, because you've got the slow change over time coming from Lyell, and then you've got this idea of kind of natural selection, right? Because Paley had this idea of a natural theology, so it's kind of this perfection over time, perfection slowly developing over time, even though his time frame was obviously much smaller. And that's sort of like your natural selection, your survival of the fittest, your traits being culled from the population under circumstances that aren't advantageous for them. And then, of course, through Malthus, you've got the red in tooth and claw, the struggle for life, as you alluded to. And all of this kind of goes into evolution by natural selection. And common ancestry was sort of a natural consequence of that, because as you move backwards in time, the changes begin to disappear and the organisms converge until you have a common ancestor of all life. And from Darwin's perspective, there was no reason to draw a line in the sand anywhere. Actually, I would assert that there still isn't. Genetics kind of would come to bolster that, because you've got Darwin doing this and just strolling around on the Beagle, and then in a monastery somewhere, Gregor Mendel is breeding his pea plants, and he's coming to realize that there are indeed these traits that exist that are passed on.
And there's something that interesting that Godfrey Smith mentions. He kind of presents Darwin's, for lack of a better phrase, intellectual integrity here, or epistemic responsibility. He was epistemically responsible. Previous to Darwin, I think I briefly mentioned it, you had these things called filaments, or these kind of, think of like a primordial soup in which, was the explanatory mechanism for all life, like everything came out of like a pot or something, like a pot of goo. Darwin rejected that. And not because he thought it was false necessarily, because he didn't see the evidence going one way or another. This is to say that Darwin entertained the idea of there being multiple trees, of evolutionary trees. Commonly we think of one tree, and that might be, I think that's the current sort of model that we have now. But he didn't jump straight to that, right? He entertained the idea that there could have been multiple sort of, for lack of a better phrase, a spontaneous generation events.
Right. I believe, oh gosh, I can't remember where he kind of gestured to lines kind of initially on his musings. But obviously it was quite easy to look at life and say, all right, well, probably all animals are related. Like, I can get behind that. And then you might say, well, the plants are pretty different though, right? So maybe the plants are something a bit separate. Mm-hmm. What about the funguses? Maybe they're also unique. And we're starting to get into microbiology as well too, where everyone was like, all right, well, if everything comes from a common ancestor, well, why did some things stay so small? And this tends to be like the why are there still monkeys argument from folks who aren't very interested in evolutionary theory. But then you have to step back and say, well, how many humans are there versus how many bacteria are there, right? It depends on how you measure success. And this idea of fitness, of reproductive success, also acted as, of course, the cornerstone to evolutionary theory. How do you pass on your genes? How successful are you at it? And how do we decide what success looks like?
Yeah, and to add to the history here, to add to the story, according to Smith, evolution was actually like just if we understand it in terms of its broad sense, was pretty much accepted by scientists. What was controversial was the mechanism. Okay.
Right. Yeah. In fact, it was so elegant when it was first proposed. There was this almost palpable from the scientific community, like, duh. Why didn't we think of that? It seemed so intuitive, and common ancestry really wasn't all that troublesome either. Like, most of the scientists, even the theologians, understood from Linnaeus onward that humans are animals, and of course, if animals change over time, well, then God must have imposed this mechanism. This wasn't problematic really until like the Seventh-day Adventists came on the scene in like the early 1900s. And up until that point, everyone was pretty on board. Like you said, it was mostly just, okay, but how does it occur? Right? What are the mechanisms behind it? How many are there? Can natural selection really do it all? And we're going to kind of, I'm sure, talk about that at some point as well.
Yeah, and I want to say that there were abuses, especially in the Gilded Age, right? Of what Darwin was saying. I think he directly addresses it in The Descent of Man. I think that's one of Darwin's published work. But stuff like social Darwinism did come up, right? And that's interesting because it showed that it was influential.
Oh, yeah.
Right, it was very influential.
Well,
that
you get these interesting dichotomies where in the likes of World War II, where social Darwinism was heavily abused and exploited, but then they're also burning copies of Origin of the Species, right? And you know the kind of there's kind of a murkiness to like the overall impact of you know evolutionary theory as to how much it was accepted kind of from the Axis powers, I suppose. That's kind of like a classic trope that goes around, like, oh, Darwinism caused World War II and the aspects of it. But Darwin was, as an individual, stark abolitionist, and in The Descent of Man, while he does use some kind of outdated and troublesome terminology that has come to have been shown to be kind of useless, like for instance, the idea that race has a basis in biology gets very strange. I mean, Klein's tends to be the more accepted idea just because people tend to interbreed in strange ways. But yeah, he was a very big proponent of this idea of the unification of humans, of existing humans. And that I think that tends to get lost in the mix of things when modern folks kind of look at him and address him because of how influential social Darwinism was. It sucks that his name got pinned to that, you know?
Yeah, and I think that if you really are interested in Darwin, definitely read The Descent of Man. That's a pretty good philosophical work. It's not so if you're a scientist and you like philosophy, read Descent of Man. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting as a text.
Yeah, and maybe towards the end of our video series, we'll do an episode on race realism, because I think that is something that biologists do. They approach that topic.
Yeah,
it's not
it's necessary to approach it and to address it. I mean, I think that you run into some strange issues when it comes to like, okay, well, what do biologists have a responsibility to talk about? Because there tends to be this idea that it's like, oh, if biology doesn't touch it, that there's an aspect of like hiddenness, and people tend to try and impose conspiracy on it, or say, well, they're only talking about it because they know it's true, or something along those lines.
Right, and I do want to, I guess, make sure that there's a difference between. I myself am not a race realist, okay, no. But there is a difference between race realism and being a racist, because some people do think that race is like a real category in biology or nature, okay, but they think they're all equal in some kind of way. So I think the idea of a racist is that there's some kind of superiority or inferiority with respect to the different races that are real, right?
That does tend to be kind of inferred there. I think that
there's a strong correlation. A lot of race realists that I meet that label themselves as race realists, that strongly correlates with white supremacy and such. But the point is that there are people, like, if I have students, and if I ask them, do you think that there is a black race, or something like that? You wouldn't be surprised to say if they said, yeah, of course, race. There are black people in the world, right? And I think there's still an intelligible way of meaning that and saying that that's true. It's just not going to be understood. The truth conditions for that are not going to be perhaps the same sorts of truth conditions you'll have as there is insulin.
And culture tends to play a huge role there. I mean, people also tend to get into that when it comes to discussing things like the difference between gender and sex. That tends to be something that also gets broached a lot, and it's important to understand what people are talking about. It's important to define our terms when we're discussing these things, because they have huge implications on people's lives. And knowing what we are actually talking about is like half the battle, it almost feels like, because people tend to misappropriate terms from biology in order to find a means to a certain end, rather. And it's the responsibility, I think, of biologists to responsibly discuss these kinds of things, so that when they do disseminate out into the public, people know what they're actually talking about when they use certain words and certain phrases.
And this goes back to our question about what is an individual in biology. So heavily pertains to how your notions of sex, gender, and race. So that will be an interesting chapter or section of the book to discuss.
Yeah,
which brings us to an interesting historical development was that when Mendel came out with his factors, which later on turned to be some kind of alleles, or am I right about that? What's the technical term for a factor nowadays?
Yeah, I don't necessarily know what Mendel. I'm not familiar enough with Mendel's kind of terminology to get at it, but yeah, you could go with alleles. It depends on kind of the level that you're speaking at.
Well, what's really interesting is that people thought that Mendel's work contradicted Darwin's work, and I think it was actually pretty interesting reasoning. The idea is that when you take something like a pea plant, you notice these generations. You have the F1 generation, F2 generation. As you go on, you start to see a consistent pattern, and the percentages, the proportions of traits are regular, right? They don't change.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of Darwin's views is that things change, right? There's these later on we think about mutations, but during Mendel's time and certainly Darwin's time, we didn't know about mutations or genes or DNA or anything like that.
Yeah.
So there was an initial tension, like, hey, look, if you look at all these generations across with these pea plants, you see no changes in the percentages, the ratios of the F generations.
Yeah, you start to get this idea of a fixity of traits. Like there are a set amount of traits that can be kind of picked from, but outside of that, you're not going to see an introduction of anything new. Which you're right would pose a very interesting challenge, especially at the time for Darwin and for those who are kind of following along with evolution by natural selection. It's not until you get this idea of, okay, well, can new information, quote unquote, be introduced? And if so, how is it introduced? And then you get into the messiness of, well, what is new information? Is it new information if you're simply tweaking something that previously existed? It depends on who you ask, as usual, that's the classic issue.
A quick side note, I think F generation, does that stand, the F there is for filial, is that right? Filial, something like that? I don't know if you know.
Yeah.
Right, does that mean a family? So. Yeah. Because for people that don't know any biology, I could be wrong, Erica will correct me, I think F generation is the generation following a parent generation, right?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Yes, you're correct. So if I didn't explain what that terminology was for any, so if you're a viewer now, okay.
Yeah, no, I double check because it's been a long time again since I've looked into like Mendel and I know what F0, F1 like moving through the generations what they are, but like what they stand for, it's been a while for me too.
Yeah, well, but then we get into a little bit of modern biology. We went from Mendel. We get some of the implications for how, like Watson and Crick, how these things happen. And of course that relates to this new discipline that emerged, the molecular biology, genetics and stuff, in the mid to late 20th century. So we'll be briefly, looking at some of those implications and those ideas. But yeah, if we want to,
synthesis has changed into the modern era, like as in where we currently live. I mean, there's been tweaking that's obviously still been occurring, but what remains very true is the foundational aspects of the theory of evolution and kind of how they're related to these other principles of biology. Principles being used quite loosely.
Right. So, for next time, we're going to be really analyzing laws, theories, and mechanisms with respect to biology. We did discuss that this might look a little different than what are those weird physicists and chemists are doing over there, but that's going to be the concentration of our next video.
These ideas of kind of straightening out what we mean when we say when we're talking about mechanisms and laws and theories, because biology is somewhat unique in that there really aren't that many laws of biology, as we kind of alluded to earlier. So why is that? And is a law in biology the same thing as a law in kind of like your harder sciences, I guess? Which is going to be very interesting. This has been kind of a more general outline of like where we're going to go with this, because philosophy of biology is so important and underappreciated. It's one of those things that everyone uses, especially those who are in the field of biology, but they don't necessarily know that they're using it. So it's good to have that foundation and know kind of where you're coming from. I think it gives a unique perspective and allows for a different way of looking at things as well that you may not have considered previously. So, you got anything else to say? Do we want to touch on anything else before we kind of nip this one in the
No, this was great. Thanks for having me on. If you're interested in some of my work, I just started a YouTube channel. It's called Phil Talk. Hopefully Erica will put it in the description. I do other stuff as well. Also, if this is Erica, so this is her channel, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
Yeah, like the video and subscribe. That's and hit the bell if you want the notifications. Of course, we gotta channel chill here.